Hello, welcome to the webcast from the Biblical Files of Dr. Mack. I am your host, Dr. Mack, and today we will continue our two-part presentation. Our first part will be, as always, from the series of Women in the Bible. We'll be talking about the daughters of Job, um, and our second part will be Blacks in the Bible. We'll be talking about Africa within the book of Job. Now, our biblical source is the book of Job, chapter 42, uh, specifically verses 14 and 15. But if you want to put it in a scriptural setting, you almost need to start with chapter 42, verses 10 through 17. Now, daughters hold a special place in the Bible, reflecting God's love, grace, and important roles that they play within the families and the communities. Now, these verses highlight their significance, providing wisdom, encouragement, and insight into God's view on daughters. Each verse is followed by a brief commentary to offer deeper understanding and reflection. Now, let's just take a look at the ones that we are focusing on. Nowhere in all the land were there found women as beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father granted them an inheritance along with their brothers. Now, that's Job 42, verse 15. Job's daughters are noted for their beauty and they receive an inheritance, signifying the value and the equity within the book of Job. It challenges the cultural norms by illustrating fairness and honoring daughters alongside sons. Now, remember, we're still in a patriarchal setting, although we are moving to a different type of writing today. We are going to be looking at wisdom literature. The past weeks, we have looked at historical literature. We've looked at the cycles of David and Abraham, the early patriarchs. But we're going to move into wisdom literature today. And it is an ancient form of legal proceedings, laments, unique terms that are not found anywhere else in the Bible. But it is interesting because we have both dialogue and poetry. Now, when was the book written? Well, we have to estimate that. We don't really have any concrete data that all scholars agree on. But it was between the 7th century and the 3rd century BCE. It has the distinction of being the oldest book in the Bible. Most of the scholars agree with that. And in Job, we see a man who is a man of God who is attacked by Satan. Although God is present, but he is attacked by Satan. Now, the rest of the book of Job deals with him defending himself against his unsympathetic friends, whom God admonishes, and God's sovereignty over nature. The book of Job consists of the various types of writing to bring out the specific speeches that are given. And we've already talked about the date, the quote unquote questionable date, but it is the one that is usually agreed upon. And the structure of the book comes from a scroll that was found called the Book of Job. And in it, we have we start with a prologue. And I find it interesting that the first two scenes are the first on earth, and the second is in heaven. This is almost one of, if we were just talking about it in general, we would talk about it in terms of being a festival book. But that's that influence that wisdom literature has on you. There are cycles within each of the speeches, depending on the person um, who's speaking at the time. Let's quickly look at the prologue on earth and in heaven. So we start with chapter 1, And this prologue is on earth, as stated earlier, and it introduces us to our character. Our character, Job, who is, I love it, a righteous man, blessed with wealth of sons and daughters, who lives in the land of Ur. The scene then shifts to heaven, where God asks Satan, you know, and it's somewhat romanticized in modern terms, and Satan is most assuredly the adversary for his opinion of Job's piety. Satan accuses Job of being pious only because he believes God is responsible for his happiness. If God were to take away everything that Job has, then he would surely curse God and die. That phrase automatically comes to mind, and you say, that's the phrase that is credited to Job's wife. Why don't you just curse your Lord and curse your God and die? Well, God gives Satan permission to strip Job of all of his wealth and kill his children and servants. But Job nonetheless continues to praise God. And one of my favorite lines from here: naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Now, in chapter 2, God further allows Satan to afflict Job's body with disfigurement and painful boils. As Job sits in ashes um, on his former estate, his wife prompts him, and I said earlier, curse your Lord and die, your God and die. But Job answers, shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? A question that really underlies questions within this whole book. So in chapter 3, we get the monologue. We get a monologue and some dialogues between Job and his three friends. But our focus today is not so much on the three friends and the suffering, because suffering is the overall theme here. But our focus today is on Job as a parent, Job as a father, Job who stepped out in this first book of wisdom literature, and we get to look at the women in the Bible who are represented by his three daughters, Jemimah, Cassie, and Keren. And each of the names has symbolic meaning. And depending on the source from which you're reading, they are a bit different, but there is a common theme that runs all the way through, all the way through. Now, when we get to, there is a particular monologue regarding, it's called the Poem of Wisdom or the Hymn of Wisdom. And it's pretty much, it is a dialogue, but it becomes sort of a lyrical poem. And we have within the book of Job two speeches by God. The first one is in chapter 38, when God speaks through a whirlwind, which I found very picturesque. God is speaking through a whirlwind. And God's speech again is on that major topic there, which is on suffering. Um, um, Not necessarily divine justice or anything like that, but it is on how the innocent respond. Now, we're going to hear the phrase over and over that he was a righteous man. But we also got to remember that God was an omnipotent God, so he knew all that was happening to Job. He knew. So God contrasts Job's weaknesses with divine wisdom and the fact that he is omnipotent. Now, in Job 42, we're getting into the chapter. Notice we're getting into the chapter and we're getting into it late. He makes a final response to God, and in his confession, he does confess. He confesses to God's power and his own lack of knowledge of things beyond me. Paraphrasing Job, beyond me, which I do not know. Previously, he had heard, but now his eyes had seen God, and therefore he declared, I retract and repent in dust and ashes. The ashes, we know, go all the way back to antiquity, and usually in the form of a death or in the form of grief. And although it wasn't the task today to look at grief, grief is one of those topics that so many have used the book of Job to bring solace when they are grieving. When they are grieving. Now, the three friends of Job in the epilogue, those three friends also um, is mentioned that they're told to make a burnt offering with Job, as Job serving as an intercessor. But only to him will I show favor. But only to him. Job is restored to health. His riches and his family are restored. The lives that we see as his children are given back, and he lives to see four generations, which puts him up there with Enoch and those very old patriarchs that we've studied earlier. Now, it is important that we know that I believe it was in the 60s where revisionists came in and they wanted to do something new, different to Job, to interpret it. And that's wonderful, the wonderful things within the Bible, which I believe makes it timeless and also the most valuable thing that we have. But they come in and they decide that here in this book, this is where we get that transition into wisdom literature, um, because Job is perfect for this. He suffers for no reason, but he never loses faith. So when we talk about Job and wisdom and the wisdom tradition that we have in the Bible, we're looking at Job, Ecclesiastics, and the book of Proverbs. They belong to that particular genre of wisdom literature. What makes them stand out is that they share a perspective that they themselves call the way of wisdom. For them, wisdom means both a way of thinking and a body of knowledge gained through such thinking, as well as the ability to apply it to life. Notice this last part. It's this way of thinking that you can apply to life, not to certain situations, but to life in general. So, in its biblical application in wisdom literature, it seems to attain, it seems to be an attainable part, through which the human effort and the gift from God can be combined and make man a much better entity. Those three books of wisdom literature share that attitude and assumption, but they differ in their conclusions. Preview coming. Proverb makes confident statements about the world and its workings that are flatly contradicted by Job and Ecclesiastic. Wisdom literature from Samaria and Babylon and Egypt offer parallels of two items, facts, and events within the book of Job, but it is impossible to tell whether the author of Job was influenced by any of them, or that his very existence or her existence suggests that was this person was the recipient of a long tradition of reflection and the existence of suffering. Now we get to take a look at first some other characteristics of wisdom literature, and then we'll take a look at the daughters of Job and how it changed things. Sort of, we won't use the word topsy turvy, but it sort of put things, it gave us a new worldview, and then it put things different. We've talked about in the historical things, we were looking at the genealogy of God's promise being fulfilled. Well, when we get to this point, we know God's promise is being fulfilled. So we get what I like to call the application part of it. So those scholars who were studying the Bible decided that the writings of Job, Ecclesiastic, and Proverbs, and there are two others, would be called the wisdom of Solomon. Because Solomon, again, we know, prayed for wisdom, and he was known as the wisest man on earth. So they are classified as wisdom literature. And specifically today, since we're talking about Job, the book of Job deals with the problem of evil and the justice of God. Job is a faithful man who loses everything. So let's take a look at the three types of wisdom that is found in the literature of these five great books, these three books for our Holy Bible, but two additional. There's what's called village wisdom or folk wisdom. It's characterized by short, pithy statements with examples drawn from nature and framed as instructions from parents to their children, as in Proverbs chapter 20, verse 4. Then we have number two, which is royal wisdom from one of the Israelite capitals, instructions to junior bureaucrats on the intricacies and the treachery of palace politics, as in Proverbs 23, verses 1 through 3. Then we get to what is called number three, theological wisdom, and that is a deep reflection on the most controversial of theological topics, such as is there a God? If there is a God, why do such awful things happen? As in illustrated in Ecclesiastes 3rd chapter, verses 19 through 21. Now, we are not talking about the prophets or the priests here. We're referring to these wise men as sages. So they had two sources for their information about life, the natural world and their wisdom tradition. So, unlike the prophets or the priests, the sages believed that God wove important practical traditions into the fabric of the universe, which were careful observations for discernment. For example, many sages believed in the balanced universe in which uh, careful practice of wisdom principles like honest speech and hard work and marital faithfulness would lead to a happy, prosperous life. Now, we were to turn that around today, we say, oh, that's prosperity. Others argue that although God's governance of the world is flawless, humans can never be sure of God's action. Even if you followed the right path, bad things could still happen to you. Proverbs 16, chapter 9, verse. Or the currents, why do bad things happen to good people? Well, if we were writing a wisdom piece of literature, we would probably follow the same kind of thinking that they did at that time. So that the sages who did this writing called wisdom believe that things happen for reasons and that humans are able to figure out the workings of the universe. The prophets, in contrast, believe that God gives divine knowledge to select humans through dreams, through visions, through ecstasy, through divine appearances. Um, but the sages, on the other hand, believe that we can work it out. Yet some of the sages felt outraged because their exception was that the universe should make sense, but in their experience, it did not. So these sages challenged the rationality of their universe and even the justice of God. But we're focusing on what? The wisdom of Job. So there's a consensus that exists that employs these wisdom themes, and Joseph begins with two chapters of prose that sets forth the blameless man who feared God and lived his upright life. And our antagonist or a bad guy, Satan, however, questions Job's motives by telling God that Job only worships him, and this is a repetitive statement, because he has been blessed by God. And basically challenges, if you take all that away, then he'll curse you. He sees man as I like to think of it as a materialistic person. He sees man, and he builds on it by bringing the three friends on, and their efforts to help in many ways become a hindrance, a hindrance in many ways. So, besides the sound advance that we get in the Bible, some of the authors were afraid to ask the hard questions, and that's where wisdom literature also comes in. Um, it understands within wisdom literature that there are going to be some insufficient answers that are given uh, regarding the suffering and the sometimes even the death. But we have to clearly look at the case of Job and know that his faith and hope, and not see Job as just a collection, an eclectic collection of proverbs, moral lessons, riddles, warnings, extended meditation, and philosophical inquiry and debate, because it includes the hymns and even the love poetry, which we'll find when we get to the Song of Songs. The human authors of the book of Job took an interest in more than just religious subjects, as anyone who reads the Bible can attest. Thus, wisdom literature is a prime example of this broad outlook on life. Now, what does this man do? Can be answered. What did he do? What can he do? Can he answer why, having been a one who followed all that was prescribed, he was allowed to suffer? Well, in the book of Job, we are given some sound advice, and the authors, who are um, anonymous, although at one point it was attributed to Moses, but it has since not held up. But they are the ones who tackle this question through the use of the friends and through the use of the verbal sparring that goes on, through the use of sometimes poetry, sometimes anger outbursts. So, in the final chapters, which we just mentioned earlier, we find it quite surprising because God answers Job in a certain sense, but does not allow Job's human intelligence to have dominance over the mystery of suffering. The poetry of God's speech is breathtaking. His description of the crocodile is the Leviathan, and the hippopotamus, which is the Belmonth, um, are fascinating. His descent into the conversation takes the form of a whirlwind, and that is what the poetry feels like. It's such a wonderful book to read, and I keep prompting you to read it, but it is such a great book. Now, let's look at some of the themes that we have in the book of Job. We know we have the theological theme as a problem of good versus evil. You know, why do the righteous suffer? Is one way that you can put it there. And we get some taglines, some key phrases that are principal to our understanding, and they are um, a justice that is a retribution, that is given, because sin was not there. So there is a type of justice that's given to make up for what happened. But again, that comes only from one person, that comes from God. Another thing that we get to take a look at in the book of Job is that of that of the adversarial and the righteous, again, that causes man to act in a certain way. In this case, we have the various different forms of speaking, where God is not speaking, where there is a poetic device that is being used, or there is an action that is full. You can almost feel the physical suffering of Job. And well, the theme comes up. Well, it is he is suffering without reason. Job is suffering without reason. So we go through these poetic verses. Now we get to chapter 28, and we'll delve with it more because it's part of our Blacks in the Bible situation. So this theme is about divine wisdom. The hymn does not place any emphasis on retribution or justice in any way. Instead, it stresses the inaccessibility of wisdom. Wisdom cannot be invented or purchased, it says. God alone knows the meaning of the word wisdom. God alone knows the characteristics of wisdom, and he grants it only to those who live in reverence before him. God possesses wisdom because he grasps the complexities of the world. And we're going to look again at Job 28, verses 24 and 26. So the thing which you look forward to in God, and this is in God's speech in chapters 38 to 41, um, with this repeated refrain, where were you when? I mean, the question is inferred or asked outright. Where were you when I needed you, pretty much? When God finally speaks, he neither explains the reason for Job's suffering, revealed to the reader in the prologue in heaven, nor does he defend his justice. The first speech focuses on his role in maintaining order in the universe. The list of things that God does and Job cannot do demonstrates divine wisdom because order is the heart of wisdom. Job then confesses his lack of wisdom, meaning his lack of understanding of the workings of the cosmos and of the ability to maintain that. Now, in the second speech, God's role in controlling the the evils that he brings. Um, the crocodile and the hippopotamus, I usually just refer to them as that way. Um, he demonstrates that he can control that. Man cannot. It can only be done through God's wisdom and the power that God has. So we get Job's reply, and then we get to take a look at some of the other interpretations. What I've been giving you so far are the things that I picked up from the reading from the biblical files that we have. So there are those scholars who refer to Job as one who suffered a test of virtue and vindication, of righteousness and glory. What a wonderful way to put that. Um, there comes into play the word of sanctified. So some scholars refer to the process that Job went through as one of sanctifying, because Job begins to understand. He had used the words, but he now understands. He lives the action out of there. So when you're reading and interpreting Job 19th chapter verses 23 through 29, they concern the redeemed, who Job hopes can save him from God. But it also becomes part of a prophecy that we get to see there. As we go on, we find out that the book of Job is one of the it is used for liturgical purposes. It is used within all types of writing and artwork. It's just remarkable the kinds of ways that man has gone to in order to put it out there for him to remember. So, in the book of Job, it has become one of the most deeply influential writings in the Western culture, to the extent that it's impossible to like make a list of what's going on. When we get to the legacy part, I will share one of the latest ones that affect um, that's really based on an African American life. Um, what we have here is in chapter 28, which we will go deep into, second time mentioning that, but it's part of the speech of Job, and it is now regarded by scholars as a separate interlude in the narrative's voice. As I said earlier, the authorship of Job is pretty much unknown. And as I said earlier, that the source material, because some of the folk um, wisdom literature is very eclectic. It comes from many of the cultures of that day, and but it's used to do the one thing. It is used to teach this lesson of wisdom and to show mankind what they have to do. So, who was this Job? Well, he was a wealthy landowner and the father and one of the best known biblical heroes of the day. But we know little more than that. He was stripped of everything without warning, and that his faith was severely tested. Talked a little bit about that earlier. And we've talked about the good and the evil that we have there. And some of the other sub themes that we need to deal with is trusting God's wisdom amid human suffering, the goodness of God's world, the relationship alike thereof between suffering and punishment, and the mystery of God's justice. Those are some secondary themes that you find in the book of Job. And to sum it up, the book of Job implies that suffering is God's punishment for human sin. Now, what is the setting? This is another interesting thing. Job is set in a land far from Israel called the author does not set the story in any clear period of ancient history, though sometime between the 7th and the 4th BCE is likely. The author does not specify when the story takes place. The story takes place in a land far from Israel, and there is the author uses um, or does not use as many physical details as the archaeologists would like, or the biblical historians would like to focus on a particular reason. But some have been very successful in locating places. So we're going to dig into that. So we don't exactly know where Earl was, but we do know, and I like this part, we do know that his wealth was measured in his livestock. We get that from Job 1 and 3. And in chapter 42:12, we know that he had a lot of livestock. We know that he had children. We know he had servants. And in fact, he was just a man who was just really, really rich with what we refer to as material things. But we get to the heart of the matter, and that, for me, turns back to Satan's attempt to afflict Job with pain and turmoil, which he did. And within that series of dialogues, we've talked about it, but then God comes through as an other, capital Other. And God eventually transcends above all things, and then Job gets the message that we need. Now, we had his characters in the book Job, well, God, Satan, Job, Job's wife, his friends, um, and uh, and others who visited him. Now, what do we have here? There, if we were going to talk about a conflict, well, there are certain things, maybe five or four of them, that we need to say. Five important things that we know about the story of Job, and we need to do the story of Job so that we can set up his relationship with his daughters. So we usually, as normal people, we just remember, oh, he suffered so long, but we also remember that everything was taken away from him. His name was Job, and we're not going with what it means, but he was one who feared God and who tried to do well, who tried to live well in God's way. As the story continues, um, we also know that, well, we don't know it when we start to read, but we do know uh, that because he's been so faithful, that there should be some time of, I trusted the Lord, so I know that this is good. So there are five important things that we need to know and remember: that he suffered while he was innocent. Number one, Job did question God. That's number two. And then we get down to Job was restored. And then Job kept his family. And that's really where we start. Throughout the entire book of Job, Job prayed. He struggled and he eventually overcame. He never stopped having a relationship with God. Not that he cursed God, as his wife had asked him to do or suggested that he do. He basically sends her away. He didn't do that. So Job was a quote unquote steadfast, is a word that we can use. He had steadfast faith, and he just he knew God would come through for him. So that faith has to always be a possibility for each one of us, and we have to be spiritually, emotionally, and physically stricken sometimes for us to remember that there is a situation where faith does come into play. Now, we talked about the three daughters, and we get down there where things are restored, you know, where the return to prosperity, as we say, in Job chapter 42, 11 through verses 11 through 17. So, what we have here is that restoration of all of the earthly things that he has. And as we think about the children, and as you look at the number of children he had and the number of children who are restored, you get one of the greatest in your face moments when you go, aha, he had seven restored. Why was that? Why didn't that double? Well, we'll talk about how the original seven lived, and the fact that Job sometimes served as a priest to his children, especially with reference to when they were doing the revelry, doing the birthday parties. The boys always had the birthday parties, but they always invited their sisters over, and for the food and the revelry. And but at the end, Job did something special as a father. He always did a sacrificial offering for them, so that seven who died, they died and moved from earth, but they moved to heaven. So he still had that seven plus the seven in the natural, or the seven on earth that he had. So how is this prosperity restoration going? Well, he had the revival of his old friendships. I love that fact. He had the revival of his family too. We're talking about the restoration of the family, and those who came bearing money and gifts. That is not what he wanted. But again, things are being seen and done with our corporal eyes instead of with our spiritual heart. So the greatest gift that he was given was the gift of the new family. The new family. So the property was returned, and he was restored in all aspects of his life. Okay? Um, and you're saying, well, he couldn't have had more children, but we're talking God's at work. There are those who said Hannah could not have had children, but she had Samuel. So God works his way in the means that he only knows how to do that. So he enjoyed his fullness of life. But when we get down to this restoration of children, please notice when you're reading, the names of the boys are not given in chapter 1 of Job, and they are not given in chapter 42 of Job. But in 42, something remarkable happens. The names of the girls are given, and each one has a specific meaning. They are given, and they are there for a reason. And it, for me, is a way to see Job for the first time, to see a different Job, especially one coming from sitting covered in ash at the beginning, outside of his former, well, his estate, when he was being afflicted. But their names express something that's even more important than um, just having more children, and they in fact are girls, and that becomes an important situation. Well, so um, his character is vindicated, his dignity and honor is restored, his prosperity is double. That he lived twice, lived to be at the age of 104. So we have in his offsprings, and we were just talking about that. So, but what did he do? He submitted himself to God, and God, preferring Job's cause, made his friends submit themselves. You know, He magnified and blessed Job, so his age and death was much longer than it would have been. So the story of Job has, as ascending because we know it's going to be good. And for those of us who are into the intercessory prayer, we have even that in here. The circumstances which those who were in attendance with Job and witnessed the restoration, they had to do something too. You know, they they had to do something, and by doing something, they too are in a way restored. Now, when we talk about there, I don't really like to see it as a problem, but that's the overall. I'm not physically well. I'm not in a good mental place. In other words, my mental health is being questioned, has been questioned. Even I sometimes have to question what's happening to me. But the whole thing is that I will remain sovereign in my belief that God will take care of all of this. That was even the accusation. You did something wrong. That's why God took away your kids. But that was just an accusation. That's not something God said. That's not something God wanted them to believe. So we get to do all of that in this one book of Job. And there is even more so that can be given. So our first child, he named his first child Jemimah. Okay? The name means fair as the day, Jemimah. Keziah is a beautiful smelling bark, which is a plant that was prized by the ancients. And you see that in Psalms 45 and 9. And then the last one is Keren. And Keren is like a horn containing kohl for the eyes, eyeliner, as it were. The Eastern women were in the habit of painting the upper part of their eyelids, okay, with this substance along the edge. They made it black. And for them, it was really sort of a symbol of having money, etc., being in a certain social class. And we find that in Second Kings 9th chapter, 30th verse, Jeremiah 4th chapter, 30th verse. The meaning of this name is paint box for a purpose. So if we just stay with those basic meanings, but they have much more to them than just that. So when we start looking at the commentaries, the various interpretations of the names, uh, something that was interesting to me. It didn't say particularly that the names came from somewhere else. It leaves you to be either extra biblical or to go, as some say, you know, in your mind's eye. But it's important that we do know those names because the first thing some of the scholars will say, but we don't know the names of the daughters, then you do need to go extra biblical to get that because you miss some of the meaning. For these three women standing here, it becomes important. It becomes a living testimony, as it were, for for them to be named these things. Why not with Jemimah? The brightness of the day, and that's what her name means. And for Casey, because he had been afflicted, and you have this smell, the aroma, according to research, says this was a bark, resembling cinnamon. The spice of cinnamon is aromatic, and it smelled good. Because notice when he was restored, his health was restored. But then there were the time that he spent when he did not smell good. He did not smell good. But here we have a situation where he is pleasant and he feels he smells good and things are all right with the world. So when we get to Keren, we have here the horn, sort of a horn. Notice when you do your Thanksgiving, you have this horn of plenty. That's a way to remember it. But here we're talking about a horn, where you put the dye and it again underscores beauty. Everything we talked about here underscores beauty for females of that time. Okay, it gave them an appearance of an enlarged eye, which meant it was ornamental, true enough, but by having that eye, it was a bigger eye and they could see more. Again, we're getting into a situation where nothing else will be concealed. Look at it that way. Nothing else will be concealed because Job now has the ability to see the things that he needs to see, and the process is done. He has done what needed to be done for his journeys tonight. Every commentator, every scholar has a different interpretation of the names of the daughters. But I want to invite you to look at what he did. He crossed the boundaries. What did he do after coming through, as a Baptist would say, trials and tribulations? He gave his daughters an inheritance equal to that of his sons, which was totally not something that was done in that day. Go back to Numbers and remember what happened when the daughters of the man who died in the wilderness had to go to Moses, and Moses went to God in order to find out, okay, how do I handle this? What do I do? How do I make this right? But here's a father giving unto his daughters. He's leaving them something. And we no longer have to think in terms of were they happy, because it appears so just from the wording in the Bible. So much has been written about their beauty, or the fact that um, this horn of an adornment is something that it could have been outside. But what you need to remember when you look at Keren, you need to see that we have emphasis here. We're talking about her outward beauty, enlarging her eyes, but what it also comes to is the inward character beauty that the daughters have. So look at it this way: the daughters represented peace, fragrance, and beauty, which are the fruits of Job's trials. Peace, fragrance, and beauty. Okay? And guess what? The story carries on into the New Testament. We get some wonderful writings from Paul in Romans 5th chapter, verses 3 and 4. And we have the products of hope all the way through Paul's writing. Again, Romans 5 and 5. And we remember that's what he wants us to do. So as we go through and we get ready to leave the actual discussion of the daughters, because they're all characterized pretty much the same way by just using the different words to describe them. It's a new life. It's a new thing. So when Job comes out of the trial, he comes out so much better. His daughters are representative of that one thing. He gets everything else back, but his daughters represent the fact that all of the camels and the sheep and the female donkeys could do. They represent that too, and the daughters actually be they are important. Or they were not always treated that way, but they are important for his legacy. Um, we're not necessarily going back to Chronicles, but it's important. And there is a piece of writing called Job's Testament, the Testament of Job, and it takes up the day after Job dies, where the wife is retelling the story, and she's explaining why those daughters were important also. Now for the legacy, and I don't want to run out of time for um, Africans in the Book of Job. Now we talked about chapter 38, but I want to call your attention to the one precious metal that is mentioned there. The thing that is mentioned there that is really, really precious is that of topaz. It's important. Now, even today, to have a piece of topaz in a ring or a necklace, or stones on a watch, on a man's watch or a female's watch. But guess what he says, and it's so important. And I'm paraphrasing because of time. Um, the topaz was in where? It was in Ethiopia. It was in the land of Cush, and uh, the we're talking about a stone that was really, it was on the Isle of serpents, where they usually found most of it, according to the commentators. And it was more precious. I love the way when you get a chance to go through that, it's more precious than gold. It's more precious than pearls. It's more precious than coral. It's the topaz. It's beautiful. Don't see it in the day. You don't see it on the island, but you do. You mark it. The persons who were going to do that, they would mark it at night and go back in the day because literally it was being protected by the serpents who were on that isle, and it goes all the way through. And when you get to the last verse in that chapter, notice what it says. It says that the topaz was um, was not as the most important thing that you had is topaz. That you still don't have unless you have wisdom. You don't have quote understanding. Now, the other thing that is happening here that we want to make sure that we get covered is the locations in the book of Job. Um, if you go and do a little research on it, you'll find that in the northeast corner of Africa and down on the tip near the horn, those are certain places that he went. And as I mentioned, you have Ethiopia, but you also have many of the other African um, countries being noted as we go through. So the legacy that we have here, it's just so it's good to read the book because it shows you what pain invariably always affects us in more ways than one. We think of physical pain, but we may not think of um, mental pain, but that does exist. And the book of Job gives us 5 ways to express or understand how hope is portrayed within this particular book. But it has to be hope, resilience, and human spirit. They all have to come together. We have the power of perseverance and the promise of redemption and restoration as we read the book. And as we go through, and we want to take from it a current legacy today, we have in the country of Ethiopia now, we have leaders who have modeled their lives not after the suffering, although they do go through the suffering, a type of suffering, um, that, but they use Job's outcome as a model for their endurance. We do have a recent movie that was released. It was a made for TV movie, and that movie, um, we have the case of Job being, we have women's rights, a case for women's rights that's in the book of Job. But I'm trying to think of the name of the movie, which is a modern day version of Job. There was one a little earlier, which was a novel. It was called Job, a Comedy of Justice. That one, as a teacher in the classroom, I did have students read, and we stressed our way through it. But at the end, we understood the themes. And I say we because it's important that the kids understand it. So the symbolic representation of the daughters will be again played out in that part that the current movie. Um, if we're going to analyze, and I'm going back and forth, Job 28 and 19, what we have there is in context, Job reflects on the value of wisdom and the search for understanding. The topaz of Ethiopia cannot equal it, nor can the values of pure gold. The comparison between the highlights of priceless things in nature and the acquisition of wisdom. Even the Egyptian topaz represents exotic and valuable treasures, underscoring wisdom, unmatched worth. It doesn't matter. And it emphasizes the incomparable value of wisdom. With all the riches, transcending the earth's greatest riches, nothing compares to what you get when you get an understanding and wanting to be one with God. So the book of Job and its influence on the leaders of Ethiopia. So this was a man who needed to find a way to follow something in the Bible, and he chose the book of Job, and he has tried since to do well. The name of the movie, if you want to write it down, is To Hell and Back. The Bible's Job gets modern African American presentation. To Hell and Back. It's a fictional tale, just as I was talking about the testimony of Job. or those that have been written about the daughters of Job. But it's interesting to see how Job lives on in personalities today, in our person, how we handle things that may not be the best in the world. Um, it is a story of a grandmother, a grandmother who raised the child up in church as usual, and what happens? They do venture to hell and back. You eventually come back to where you are supposed to be. But I hope you have enjoyed our presentation today. Don't forget to take a look at Job's daughters the next time you read. Take a look not at the beauty part, and beauty is there because it's placed against the ugliness of evil. It is there. But look at what each means to Job at this particular juncture in his life. One of the things that you want to remember as we go through these three women didn't have speaking voice. The mom did, but we are talking about the mom. Um, but the girls do not. They are there. They display their love for Job. They understand they are being treated just as the brothers are being treated. Because Job has something to shout about, he has something to sing about. Now, join me next time we move to the book of Psalms, and again we'll take on the subject of daughters. These daughters are unnamed, however. I hope you have enjoyed, and may God bless and keep you throughout the day and the rest of the year. Thank you very much for joining me today.